The town of Plainfield, Wisconsin had 647 residents in the fall of 1957. Everyone knew everyone. Doors stayed unlocked. Children played freely in the streets. It was the kind of place where the worst crime was usually a drunk farmer sleeping it off in his pickup truck. On Saturday, November 16th, the town was quieter than usual. Opening day of deer hunting season meant most of the men were deep in the woods, rifles in hand, hoping to fill their freezers before winter set in hard. Main Street was almost deserted. The hardware store, normally open by 8 a.m., remained dark. The owner, Bernice Wardens, a 58-year-old widow who'd run the business for years, hadn't turned on the lights or unlocked the door. Her son, Frank, a deputy sheriff in a neighboring county, had been deer hunting all day. He'd promised his mother he'd stop by after to help her close up. But when he arrived, something felt wrong immediately. The door was unlocked, the store was empty, and there was blood on the floor. Not just a few drops, a pool of it, dark, congealed, hours old. The cash register was missing from the counter. Drag marks led from the pool of blood toward the back door. And on the counter, beneath the empty space where the register had been, Frank found something that made his blood run cold. A sales slip, in his mother's handwriting. Last entry of the day. Antifreeze, Ed Gein. Within 20 minutes, Sheriff Art Schley was racing toward the store, his deputy Dan Chase beside him. By nightfall, they were driving 9 miles out of town, down a long dirt road that led to a property everyone in Plainfield knew about, but few ever visited. The old game place. Local children called it the haunted house. They'd dare each other to run up and touch the door on Halloween night. Slap the wood, sprint back screaming. It was all in fun. The house was creepy, sure, but Ed Gein himself was harmless. Odd, maybe. A little slow, but harmless. The house had no electricity in most of the rooms. No phone line. Windows were broken or boarded over. Paint peeled from the wooden siding like dead skin. They knocked. No answer. They tried the front door. Locked. Went around back. Also locked, but there was a shed attached to the side of the house. The door was barely secured, held only by a rusty latch that wouldn't hold against a strong wind. Sheriff Schley looked at Deputy Chase. Chase nodded. Schley kicked the door open. The smell hit them first. Metallic. Sweet. Putrid. The smell of a butcher shop that had been closed for weeks in summer heat. Schley stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across rusty tools, old newspapers, piles of unidentifiable debris. Chase followed, breathing through his mouth, one hand covering his nose. And then Schley's flashlight beam caught something hanging from the rafters. For a moment, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. The shape was wrong, too white, too exposed. And then understanding crashed over him like ice water. It was a human body, headless, hanging upside down by the ankles from a wooden beam, arms bound to the sides with baling wire, split open from sternum to pelvis, internal organs removed, dressed out exactly like a deer carcass after a hunt. Schley made it 3 steps before his stomach rebelled. He crashed through the door, fell to his knees, and vomited into the frozen dirt. Deputy Chase, his hand shaking so badly the flashlight beam jerked across the shed like a strobe light, forced himself to look closer. The body was female, middle-aged, and from the blood spatter pattern on the floor, she hadn't been killed here. She'd been brought here, hung here, butchered here. It was Bernice Wardens. But this was just the beginning, because inside the main house, investigators would discover something that would fundamentally change how America understood evil. To understand what happened in that farmhouse, you have to go back 40 years. Back to a boy and his mother. Back to the seeds of madness planted in fertile soil. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He was the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His brother Henry was 5 years older. Augusta Wilhelmine Lerk Gein was born in 1878 to German Lutheran immigrants. She grew up in a world of fire and brimstone, of sin and salvation, of absolute moral certainty. And somewhere along the way, that certainty curdled into something darker. She believed, truly, deeply believed, that the world was fundamentally corrupted, That women, all women except herself, were vessels of sin. That men were weak creatures who needed to be protected from temptation. That salvation could only be found through absolute obedience to God's word and her interpretation of it. She married George Philip Gein, a weak-willed alcoholic who ran a small grocery store in La Crosse. George was quiet, passive, broken. When he came home drunk, which was often, Augusta would scream at him, berate him, tear him apart with words sharp as knives. And George would take it, say nothing, do nothing, just absorb the abuse like a sponge absorbing water. Young Ed watched this, absorbed it. In his developing mind, a pattern formed. Women had power. Women controlled everything. Men were weak, pathetic creatures who deserved their suffering. Except Mother. Mother was different. Mother was strong. Mother was righteous. Mother was the only pure soul in a corrupted world. Every night, Augusta would gather her sons and read to them from the Bible. Not the gentle passages about love and forgiveness. The dark ones, the violent ones, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities consumed by fire for their sexual sin. The horror of Babylon from the book of Revelation, drunk on the blood of saints. Ezekiel's prophecies of doom and destruction. She told them that all women except her were prostitutes at heart, that they used their bodies to trap men and drag them down to hell, that the world outside their door was a cesspool of corruption waiting to destroy them. And Ed believed her, completely, absolutely, without question. In 1914, when Ed was 8 years old, Augusta decided she'd had enough of La Crosse. Too many bars, too many loose women, too many opportunities for her sons to be corrupted. She sold the grocery store and used the money to buy 195 acres of isolated farmland outside Plainfield, Wisconsin. The property was miles from town with no close neighbors, just fields and forest and silence. It was perfect for what Augusta wanted: complete isolation, complete control. Ed attended the local school in Plainfield, but Augusta made sure he had no friends. Every time Ed mentioned a classmate, someone he talked to, someone he liked to play with, Augusta found a reason to forbid it. That boy's father drinks. That girl's mother wears makeup. Vanity is a sin. They're not our kind of people. Edward. The other children thought Ed was strange. He was small, effeminate, shy. He'd laugh at inappropriate times, sudden, high-pitched giggles that made other kids uncomfortable. He had trouble making eye contact, and he smelled odd, like unwashed clothes and farm animals. They left him alone, and Ed learned to be alone. At home, Augusta drilled him in reading and scripture. He became an excellent reader, devouring books at a pace unusual for a child his age. But every book, every story, was filtered through Augusta's worldview. Every tale became a morality lesson about sin and corruption. Ed worshipped her. To him, she wasn't just his mother. She was a prophet, a saint, the only light in a dark world. His brother Henry saw things differently. Henry was 5 years older. He worked jobs around town, talked to other people, started developing his own ideas about the world. And as he grew into manhood, he began to see his mother for what she really was: a tyrant, a fanatic, a woman whose religious fervor had crossed the line into mental illness. He started saying things, dangerous things. Ed, you know Mother isn't always right, don't you? The way she talks about women, that's not normal. That's not healthy. Ed couldn't hear it, wouldn't hear it. In his mind, questioning Mother was the worst sin imaginable. Worse than murder, worse than anything. The brothers' relationship grew tense, strained, hostile. In 1940, their father, George, died of heart failure at age 66. Years of alcoholism had finally caught up with him. Ed felt nothing. His father had been a ghost in his own home for decades, a silent, broken thing that barely registered as human. Now it was just three of them: Augusta, Henry, and Ed. And the tension between the brothers reached a breaking point. On May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were clearing brush on their property using a controlled burn, a common farming practice in Wisconsin. You set fire to a section of dry vegetation and contain it, clearing land for planting. But on this day, the wind shifted. The fire got out of control, spreading faster than they could contain it. The brothers split up, trying to create fire breaks to stop the spread before it reached the house or neighboring properties. And somewhere in the chaos of smoke and flame, Henry disappeared. Ed came running to a neighbor's farm just as the sun was setting. His face was smudged with soot, his breathing labored. "It's Henry," he gasped. "We were fighting the fire, and I lost him in the smoke. I don't know where he is. We need help." The neighbor gathered a group of men. They headed back to the Gein property as darkness fell, armed with flashlights and lanterns, calling Henry's name into the smoke-filled twilight. Ed led them through the burned field. He claimed he didn't know where his brother had gone.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Said he'd lost sight of him in the smoke and couldn't find him again. But then, as they searched in the growing darkness, Ed suddenly stopped. "There," he said quietly. I think he might be over there." He led them directly to Henry's body. Henry Gein lay face down in an area that hadn't even been touched by the fire. The grass around him was unburned. His clothes showed no sign of flame damage. His skin wasn't scorched, but there were bruises on his head, dark marks that didn't match the story of smoke inhalation. The men looked at Ed. Questions formed on their lips. How did you know where to find him if you lost him in the smoke? Why isn't the body burned if he died in the fire? What are those marks on his head? But this was 1944, rural Wisconsin. People died on farms all the time. Accidents happened. The local coroner ruled it death by asphyxiation, smoke inhalation. No autopsy was performed. No investigation was opened. Henry Gein was buried 3 days later in Plainfield Cemetery. The questions went unasked. The truth went unspoken. And Ed Gein finally had what he'd always wanted, his mother all to himself. For the next year and a half, it was just Ed and Augusta. No Henry to question. No Henry to challenge. No Henry to see the unhealthy bond between mother and son for what it truly was. For Ed, this was paradise. He cared for her obsessively, cooked her meals, read to her every night, worked the farm just enough to keep them fed. They lived in isolation, in a world of two, where Augusta's word was law and Ed's devotion was absolute. But Augusta was getting older, slower. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her movements were stiff, pained. She tired easily. In March 1945, Augusta suffered a stroke. Ed found her collapsed on the kitchen floor, her face slack on one side, unable to speak clearly. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing now, and carried her to his truck, driving like a madman to the small hospital in Wild Rose. She survived, but she was changed. The stroke left her partially paralyzed. She needed a wheelchair, needed help with everything: eating, bathing, dressing, moving from room to room. Ed became her full-time caretaker. He barely slept. He was always there, always watching, always ready to meet her needs. Other men his age, he was 39 now, had wives, children, lives of their own. Ed had only his mother, and that was enough. That was everything. On December 29th, 1945, Augusta suffered a second stroke. Ed sat beside her bed, holding her hand, begging her not to leave him. But her breathing grew shallower, slower. Her hand went cold in his. At 2:17 a.m., Augusta Wilhelmine Gein died, and something in Ed Gein broke beyond repair. At the funeral, Ed couldn't stop crying. Not like an adult grieving a parent. Like a child, sobbing, hysterical, inconsolable. Other mourners had to support him, practically carry him away from the grave. He was crying like a baby, one witness later remembered. Couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. It was like he'd lost everything in the world. He had. Ed Gein was 39 years old, and for the first time in his entire life, he was alone. No one to tell him what to do. No one to protect him from the sinful world. No one to love. The isolation that had once felt safe now felt like drowning. The first thing he did was seal off her world. Her bedroom. He closed the door, locked it, then nailed it shut with boards. Everything inside was to remain exactly as she'd left it. The upstairs where she used to sit, boarded up, forbidden. The main kitchen where she'd cooked, abandoned. He never used it again. He moved into the small room downstairs that the family had called the summer kitchen. A cramped space barely large enough for a bed, a table, and a wood stove. And there, surrounded by his mother's ghost, Ed Gein began to spiral into madness. He stopped cleaning, stopped maintaining the house. The Order Augusta had insisted upon dissolved into chaos.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Ed started hoarding. Newspapers stacked floor to ceiling. Magazines in towers that threatened to topple. Tin cans, glass bottles, bits of string, rubber bands, scraps of wire. He kept jars filled with used chewing gum. Another jar with his fingernail clippings. Everything was saved. Nothing was thrown away. The house became a tomb, a monument to decay. But he was still reading. Voraciously, obsessively. Pulp magazines about true crime. Lurid tales of murder and mayhem. Stories about Nazi war atrocities and medical experiments. He bought anatomy textbooks from a mail-order catalog and studied them like sacred texts, memorizing the names of bones, the layout of organs, the structure of human skin. And he became fascinated with one particular type of story, grave robbing. Tales of ghouls who crept into cemeteries at night. Body snatchers who sold corpses to medical schools. Resurrection men who dug up the recently dead for profit or perversion. These stories spoke to something deep inside Ed. Something that had been planted by his mother's death and was now growing, spreading, consuming him. At night, alone in his decaying farmhouse, Ed would read these stories and feel something stir. A hunger, a need, a terrible curiosity about what lay beneath the earth in Plainfield Cemetery. About 18 months after his mother's death, that curiosity became action. Ed started reading the obituary section of the Plainfield and surrounding area newspapers. Every day, religiously, he was looking for something specific. Women, middle-aged women, freshly deceased, women about his mother's age when she died. When he found one that fit his criteria, he'd write down the details. Name, age, date of death, location of burial, funeral home, and then he'd wait. He'd wait until well after midnight, until Plainfield was asleep, until the last lights in farmhouse windows had gone dark. Then he'd get in his truck, put a shovel and a rope in the back, and drive to the cemetery. He'd park far from the entrance, in a grove of trees or behind a barn, and walk the rest of the way, his shovel over his shoulder like a rifle. The first time, his hands shook so badly he could barely grip the shovel. His heart hammered in his chest. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made him freeze, certain he'd been discovered. But no one came. No one saw. He found the grave he was looking for. A woman named Grace Benson died 3 days earlier at age 51. The earth over her coffin was still soft, easy to dig. Ed began to work. Day. The shovel bit into soil. He worked steadily, mechanically, his breath forming clouds in the cold November air. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the chill. Down through the earth. After nearly 2 hours, the shovel struck wood. The coffin. Ed cleared away the remaining dirt and gripped the edge of the coffin lid. He had a crowbar in his truck for this moment. He wedged it under the lid and pried. Wood groaned. Nails pulled free. The seal broke. The smell hit him. Chemicals, decay, something floral and wrong. Ed opened the coffin fully and looked at Grace Benson for the first time. She was still fresh enough, preserved enough. The funeral home had done their job well. Ed had brought a knife, a boning knife from his kitchen. What he did next would set him on a path from which there was no return. By the time the sun rose, Ed was back at his farm. The grave had been refilled, the flowers replaced. No one would know he'd been there. In the back of his truck, wrapped in a tarp, was something that would have horrified anyone who saw it. But no one saw. No one knew. Over the next several years, Ed Gein would return to the cemeteries around Plainfield approximately 40 times. Most visits ended without success. The ground was too hard. Someone was nearby. He lost his nerve, but at least 9 times that he would later confess to, he succeeded. 9 graves robbed, 9 bodies stolen, 9 women who would never rest in peace. And in his farmhouse, alone with the dead, Ed Gein began his work. Ed had learned taxidermy as a young man, taught by a neighbor who stuffed and mounted deer heads. He knew how to skin an animal, how to preserve the hide, how to stretch and cure leather. Now, he was applying those skills to human remains. He would carefully remove skin from the bodies he'd taken, strip it away in large sections. The process was meticulous, almost surgical. He'd cure the skin with salt, treating it like animal leather, stretch it on frames, let dry, tan it, and then he'd begin creating. Over the years, Ed Gein assembled what investigators would later call the most disturbing collection in American criminal history. For chairs in his dining room, the seats appear to be woven cane at first glance. But closer inspection revealed the truth. Human skin, carefully woven, stretched, preserved. A lampshade. The craftsmanship was impressive. Even neat stitching, carefully selected material, made entirely from human skin. A wastebasket, adrum, the sheath for a hunting knife. All human skin. 9 bowls, polished smooth and gleaming. They looked almost beautiful until you understood what they were. The tops of human skulls, sawed off at the eyebrows, cleaned, polished. Ed used them as soup bowls. A shoebox found on a shelf in his summer kitchen. Inside, 9 female genital, carefully preserved with salt, dried like jerky. A belt made from human leather, decorated with female nipples sewn on like buttons. And hanging on the walls like hunting trophies, masks made from the faces of women. The skin had been carefully peeled from their skulls, the eyes and mouths cut out, newspaper stuffed inside to hold the shape. Some still had hair attached. Some were painted with makeup, as if Ed had been trying to bring them back to life. But the most disturbing item, the one that would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives, was something Ed had made to wear. A vest constructed from the skin and breasts of a woman's torso. Real breasts, carefully preserved, attached to a vest of human leather. Leggings fashioned from human leg skin. Female genitalia that could be tied on with string. Ed had created a full-body woman's suit. Neighbors would occasionally report seeing something strange on clear nights. A figure in the fields behind the Gein farm, dancing in the moonlight, spinning in circles with arms outstretched. They thought it was just Ed being eccentric, odd but harmless. They had no idea he was wearing human skin. Psychiatrists who would later examine Ed came to a disturbing conclusion. He wasn't interested in these women sexually, at least not in any conventional sense. He wanted to become them, to wear their skin and transform into a woman, to become his mother. In Ed's fractured mind, if he couldn't bring Augusta back from the dead, he could become her himself. He could wear a woman's body like a costume and, in those moments, feel his mother's presence again. For years, this was Ed Gein's secret life. By day, he was the helpful handyman, the guy you'd hire to chop wood or babysit your kids. Odd, but harmless. By night, he was something else entirely. But as the years passed, Ed's needs began to change. The bodies from his cemetery were old, decomposed, not fresh. He wanted something new, something alive. And that's when Mary Hogan caught his attention. 12 miles from Plainfield, in the even smaller town of Bancroft, there was a tavern called Hogan's. It was run by a tough, outspoken woman named Mary Hogan. Mary was 51 years old, twice divorced. She lived in Chicago before moving to rural Wisconsin, and she brought some of that big city attitude with her. She could drink most men under the table. She cursed like a sailor. She didn't take any nonsense from drunk customers.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
The locals called her Bloody Mary, not because she was violent, but because her language could peel paint off walls. Ed Gein was a regular at Hogan's Tavern, though regular might be overstating it. He'd come in every few weeks, sit in the corner, and nurse a single cup of coffee for hours. He didn't drink alcohol. That was his father's sin, and alcoholism was a weakness Ed had been taught to despise. But he'd sit there quiet and watchful and stare at Mary as she worked. In his mind, Mary reminded him of his mother. Same age, same build, same commanding presence, same strength. But Mary was everything Augusta had despised. She drank. She swore. She was loud and sexual and free. She flirted with male customers. She wore makeup. She existed in the world without shame or fear. It repulsed Ed. It fascinated him. On December 8th, 1954, around 4:30 in the afternoon, a local farmer named Seymour Lester stopped by Hogan's Tavern. He wanted to buy some ice cream for his daughter. Mary sold basic groceries alongside the beer and liquor. The door was unlocked. Mary's truck was parked outside, exhaust still warm. But the tavern was empty, and there was blood on the floor. Not just a few drops, a substantial pool of it, dark and congealed on the worn wooden floorboards. Drag marks led from the pool toward the back door, as if something heavy had been pulled through. The cash register stood open on the bar, money scattered across the counter. Some bills, some change. Whoever had been here hadn't taken it all. Seymour Lester backed out of the tavern slowly, his heart hammering, then ran to his truck and drove straight to the nearest phone. Sheriff Harold Thompson arrived within the hour with 2 deputies. What they found looked like a robbery gone wrong, but something about it didn't sit right. A single .32 caliber shell casing rested on the floor near the pool of blood. Blood spatter on the wall suggested a gunshot. I know you love this part. Hang tight, part 2's on the way.